There is a kind of silence that feels wrong. Not peaceful, not restful, just heavy. The room is quiet. The lights are low. Nothing is asking anything from you anymore. And that's when it begins. The inner voice. It doesn't shout. It doesn't panic. It doesn't even sound dramatic. It just keeps going, explaining, replaying, correcting, rewriting moments that already happened. You tell yourself it's just overthinking. You tell yourself you're tired. You tell yourself it will pass. But it doesn't. It follows you into bed, into the dark, into that space where there's nothing left to distract you. And you start wondering, why now? Why this? Why won't it stop? Most people assume this is a problem to fix, something to quiet, something to control, something to escape from. But Carl Jung would have said something very different. He would have said, this is not noise. This is a signal. And for many people, this moment, when the inner voice becomes impossible to ignore, marks the beginning of a spiritual awakening. Not the romantic kind, not the peaceful kind, but the real one. If the inner voice were just random noise, it would fade. That's the part most people miss. Random thoughts come and go. They lose strength when you ignore them. They dissolve when your attention moves elsewhere. But this voice doesn't dissolve. It returns. It comes back to the same themes, the same people, the same moments, as if it's circling something important but unfinished. Carl Jung had a very specific word for this kind of repetition. He called it constellation. When something in the psyche is constellated, it means a certain pattern of energy has become active, not intellectually, emotionally. And when that happens, the mind doesn't feel calm. It feels occupied. This is why the voice often sounds urgent, even when nothing urgent is happening in your external life. You can be lying in bed, physically safe, with nothing required of you, and still feel mentally alert, tense, almost on watch. Because what's activated isn't a problem in the present. It's unfinished material from the past that has re-entered the present. Most people think they are thinking too much. But in Jungian terms, what's happening is very different. You're not thinking. You're being thought by a complex. A complex is not a disorder. It's not a label. It's a fragment of the psyche that formed around a strong emotional experience and never fully resolved. And here's the part that makes people uncomfortable. Complexes have autonomy. They speak. They react. They argue. They defend. When a complex is activated, the inner voice becomes repetitive, defensive, explanatory. It replays conversations. It prepares arguments. It imagines future encounters. Not because you're obsessive, but because that part of you is still trying to protect itself. Think about how the voice sounds. Does it explain? Does it justify? Does it rehearse what you should have said? That's not random thinking. That's a psychological structure trying to complete something it never got to finish. And this is where awakening quietly begins, not in peace, but in pressure. Because awakening doesn't activate your best qualities first. It activates what was unresolved, what was suppressed, what was adapted, what learned to stay silent to survive. The psyche does not move toward growth by accident. It moves toward it by irritation, by repetition, by creating enough inner discomfort that you can no longer ignore what has been split off. And the more conscious a person becomes, the more obvious this split feels. This is why intelligent, introspective, emotionally perceptive people often experience this phase more intensely. They don't just notice the noise. They feel the contradiction. They feel the gap between who they are on the outside and what is happening inside. And the mind reacts, not to punish, but to signal. This is the moment most people misunderstand. They assume the voice is the enemy. They assume the goal is to overpower it. But Jung warned that whatever we fight inside ourselves becomes stronger, not weaker, because opposition gives energy. And when you oppose the inner voice without understanding it, you feed the very pattern you want to escape. We'll come back to this, because this is where many people unknowingly prolong their suffering. For now, here's what matters. If the inner voice won't stop, it doesn't mean you're failing at peace. It means something in you has become active, something with a history, something with memory, something with emotion. And until it's acknowledged, it will keep returning, not louder, but more persistent. In the next part, we need to look at why our culture tells us to silence this voice, and why that advice often makes the problem worse. Because once you understand that, the experience stops feeling like chaos and starts making psychological sense. Before we talk about shadow or awakening or anything spiritual, we need to talk about the world you're living in. Because the modern mind is not loud by accident. It's loud by design. For most of human history, the mind had space, long pauses, natural rhythms, moments of boredom that allowed thoughts to rise and fall on their own. Today, that space is almost gone. From the moment you wake up, your nervous system is surrounded by sound. Not always literal sound, but mental noise. Notifications, messages, screens, updates, unfinished conversations that never truly end. Your phone vibrates, and your body reacts before your mind does. Your attention is pulled, redirected, fragmented, dozens of times an hour. Even silence is no longer silent. There's always something playing, something scrolling, something waiting, and the mind adapts. It learns to stay alert, to monitor constantly, to anticipate the next interruption. This creates a background hum in the psyche, a low-level vigilance that never fully turns off. So when you finally lie down at night, your mind doesn't know how to rest. It only knows how to continue, because it has been trained to do exactly that. Modern life doesn't just occupy your time. It occupies your inner space. And when the outer noise finally stops, the inner noise rushes in to fill the vacuum. This is why the inner voice often feels louder in moments of supposed calm. Your nervous system has been overstimulated for so long that stillness feels unfamiliar, almost unsafe. Jung lived before smartphones, before social media, before the constant flood of information. And yet, he warned about something eerily similar. He believed that when the psyche is overwhelmed by external demands, it loses its natural rhythm. The individual becomes identified with reaction instead of reflection, with response instead of meaning. In modern terms, we might say, the mind becomes crowded, but the soul becomes neglected. And what is neglected does not disappear. It accumulates. Unprocessed experiences stack on top of each other. Emotions are postponed. Questions are deferred. Conflicts are muted rather than resolved. Until one day, the system slows down, often at night, during illness, or during a life transition, and everything that was postponed demands attention at once. The inner voice isn't creating new material. It's replaying what was never given space to finish. Think about how many conversations in your life never truly end anymore. Messages that fade instead of closing. Conflicts that dissolve into silence rather than resolution. Relationships that stop without clarity. Your mind keeps track of all of it. And when the world finally goes quiet, your psyche says, "Now we can talk." This is why so many people feel mentally exhausted even when nothing happens. Their minds are not resting, they're processing, constantly. And here's where modern advice becomes dangerous. We're told to silence the mind in a world that never gives the mind a chance to complete anything. We're told to be calm while living inside a system that rewards constant stimulation. So when people fail to find peace, they blame themselves. But the issue is not personal weakness. It's environmental pressure. The psyche was not designed for perpetual interruption. And when something essential is interrupted long enough, it eventually forces its way back in. Often as repetition, often as inner dialogue, often as a voice that won't stop. This doesn't mean your awakening is caused by technology. But modern life amplifies what the psyche is already trying to resolve. It removes the natural pauses that once allowed integration to happen gradually. So instead, integration arrives all at once, loud, insistent, overwhelming. And this is why simply trying to quiet the mind rarely works. You're not dealing with a volume problem. You're dealing with an accumulation. When the inner voice repeats itself, it's not because your mind is weak. It's because something inside you was never allowed to finish its sentence. Carl Jung called this part of the psyche the shadow, not because it's dark, but because it lives outside the light of your conscious identity. The shadow is made of everything you learned to push aside in order to function. Feelings that were inconvenient, needs that felt like too much, truths that threatened connection or belonging. At some point in life, you learned what was acceptable to express and what wasn't, and whatever didn't fit became quiet. Not gone, just quiet. But the shadow doesn't disappear simply because it's ignored. It waits, and when the conditions are right, when the outer world slows down, when distractions weaken, when identity begins to shift, the shadow becomes active. This is when the inner voice changes its tone. It becomes repetitive. It becomes emotional. It becomes personal. You're no longer just thinking about abstract ideas. You're reliving moments. Moments where you stayed silent. Moments where you adapted too much. Moments where you swallowed something you never fully accepted. The voice keeps returning to these scenes because, psychologically, they are unfinished. The shadow is not trying to hurt you. It's trying to be integrated. And integration doesn't mean acting out everything the shadow contains. It means recognizing what it holds. For example, many people hear an inner voice that constantly explains itself. It justifies. It prepares defenses. It imagines being misunderstood. That voice often belongs to a shadow that learned early on it had to explain itself to be safe. Others hear a voice filled with criticism. Harsh, unforgiving, never satisfied. That voice often carries anger that was never allowed to surface directly. So it turned inward. The mind repeats these patterns not because it enjoys suffering, but because repetition is the psyche's way of asking for consciousness. Jung believed that what remains unconscious controls us, and control often feels like compulsion. This is why the inner voice feels urgent. It doesn't feel optional. It feels like something you're pulled into against your will. And here's a crucial point. People going through spiritual awakening often experience an intensification of the shadow, not a reduction of it. As awareness increases, so does contrast. You become more sensitive to inner dishonesty, more aware of misalignment, less able to numb or distract. So the shadow, sensing an opening, steps forward. Not gently, but persistently. This is why awakening often feels uncomfortable before it feels meaningful. The psyche is reorganizing around truth instead of adaptation. And truth is rarely quiet at first. Most people try to suppress this phase. They label it regression. They label it anxiety. They label it negative thinking. But Jung would say this is a dangerous mistake, because suppressing the shadow doesn't eliminate it. It drives it deeper, where it gains more power, not less. The inner voice becomes louder when it's denied, softer when it's understood. And this is where the modern misunderstanding becomes clear. We are taught to fix symptoms instead of listening to meaning. So we try to silence the voice. But the voice isn't the problem. It's the messenger. And once you see that, the experience changes. Not overnight, but fundamentally. Because instead of asking, how do I make this stop? You begin asking, what part of me has been waiting to be acknowledged? And that question quietly shifts the entire process. In the next part, we'll explore why this often begins at very specific moments in life, moments where identity itself starts to dissolve. Because awakening doesn't arrive randomly. It arrives when an old version of you can no longer carry the truth of who you're becoming. Spiritual awakening rarely arrives with clarity. It arrives with confusion. Most people expect awakening to feel like certainty, like finally knowing who you are and where you're going. But in reality, awakening often begins when you no longer recognize yourself in the life you've been living. The roles that once fit start to feel tight. The motivations that once drove you begin to lose meaning. You still perform them, but without conviction. And this is where the inner voice becomes relentless. Because what's speaking now is not anxiety. It's disidentification. Carl Jung described this process as the weakening of the persona, the social mask we build to adapt, belong, and survive. The persona is not false. It's necessary. But when we over-identify with it, we lose contact with the deeper self. An awakening often begins at the moment when the persona can no longer carry the truth of who you are becoming. This is why the inner voice often intensifies during transitions, midlife, relationship endings, burnout, illness, periods of isolation. From the outside, these moments look disruptive. From the inside, they feel destabilizing. You still know how to function, but you no longer know why. And when meaning collapses, the psyche reacts. It begins searching. It questions old beliefs. It re-examines past choices. It replays life as if looking for a missing thread. The inner voice becomes active because identity is no longer stable, and the mind tries to restore coherence. This is where many people panic. They assume something is wrong because certainty is gone. But Jung saw this phase as essential. He believed individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated person, begins when the old identity starts to dissolve. Awakening, in this sense, is not about gaining something new. It's about losing what no longer fits. And loss is never quiet. The inner voice speaks louder when the structure it relied on collapses. This is why awakening often feels lonely. You may still be surrounded by people, but internally you feel displaced. Conversations feel shallow. Old goals feel irrelevant. You sense a growing distance between who you are and who you're expected to be. And the mind reacts. It tries to negotiate. It revisits old versions of yourself. It asks, should I go back? But there is no going back. Once awareness expands, it cannot contract without cost. So the psyche pushes forward, even when you resist. The inner voice becomes the battlefield where this struggle plays out. Part of you wants stability. Another part wants truth. And until those parts are integrated, the dialogue continues. This is why awakening often coincides with mental exhaustion. You are not weak. You are carrying an internal transition. Jung believed that during individuation, the psyche often enters a phase of inner chaos. Old symbols lose meaning before new ones appear. This is deeply unsettling, especially in a world that demands certainty. So the mind keeps talking, searching for orientation, not because it enjoys noise, but because it is trying to rebuild identity on more honest ground. And this is where modern misunderstanding does real harm. We treat this phase as a problem to eliminate. We label it dysfunction. But Jung would say this is the psyche doing exactly what it is meant to do. It is dismantling a structure that no longer serves the self. And that process is rarely comfortable. In the next part, we need to talk about why this phase becomes most intense at night, and why trying to force peace during this stage often backfires. Because timing matters. And so does the way you respond to this voice. There is a reason this inner voice becomes louder at night. During the day, your nervous system is busy performing. You answer. You react. You adjust. Your attention is constantly pulled outward, and that outward focus keeps the unconscious partially contained. But at night, the structure collapses. There is no role to play, no response expected, no one watching, and the psyche finally has space. This is when the inner voice steps forward, not because something new has appeared, but because nothing is holding it back anymore. From a nervous system perspective, your body is shifting from action into stillness. From a Jungian perspective, the ego loosens its grip. And when the ego relaxes, unconscious material rises. This is why you can feel physically safe and mentally unsettled at the same time. The mind starts replaying unfinished conversations. Old emotional scenes surface without warning. Thoughts loop with a strange sense of urgency. You may feel tired, deeply tired, yet unable to sleep. This creates a painful contradiction. You want rest, but the psyche wants resolution. And this is where many people make a critical mistake. They try to force peace. They tell themselves to just relax. They push the thoughts away. They reach for techniques meant to silence the mind. But Jung warned that peace achieved through suppression is not peace at all. It is avoidance. When unconscious material is pushed down before it is understood, it does not dissolve. It waits, and then it returns with more intensity. This is what Jung described as repression disguised as spirituality. Today, we might call it spiritual bypassing. Using calmness to avoid conflict. Using silence to avoid truth. Using techniques to escape what feels uncomfortable inside. The problem is not the desire for peace. The problem is the timing. Peace that arrives before integration is fragile. It cracks under pressure. This is why some people feel calm during meditation, only to be overwhelmed the moment they stop. Nothing was integrated. Nothing was resolved. The voice was merely held down. And what is held down eventually pushes back. This doesn't mean practices like meditation are useless. It means they must be paired with psychological honesty. The inner voice does not need to be eliminated. It needs to be met. At night, when the world finally goes quiet, the psyche asks a simple question. Will you listen now? If the answer is no, the voice grows louder. If the answer is yes, even briefly, even imperfectly, something begins to shift. Not immediately, but subtly. Because the psyche responds not to control, but to recognition. And this is the turning point most people never reach. They exhaust themselves trying to silence a process that is actually guiding them toward wholeness. In the final part, we'll talk about what real integration looks like, not as a technique, but as a relationship with your inner world. Because the voice that won't stop is not asking for obedience. It's asking for consciousness. One of the biggest misunderstandings in this phase is the idea that integration means making the inner voice disappear. It doesn't. Integration doesn't begin with silence. It begins with relationship. Carl Jung believed that the psyche heals not when it is controlled, but when it is acknowledged. The inner voice softens not because it is defeated, but because it is finally taken seriously. This is why forcing calm never works for long. Control creates tension. Integration creates space. When you stop fighting the voice, you begin to notice something subtle. The thoughts matter less than the pattern. The words matter less than the emotion underneath. Often, the voice isn't demanding action. It's asking for honesty. Honesty about who you are becoming. About what no longer fits. About what has been postponed inside you for too long. This is why the voice doesn't vanish all at once. But it changes. It becomes less urgent, less repetitive, less sharp, because it no longer needs to force its way in. The psyche doesn't want perfection. It wants wholeness. And wholeness includes tension, uncertainty, and unfinished questions, especially during awakening. So if the voice still returns some nights, that doesn't mean you're failing. It means the process is still unfolding. And unfolding is not linear. One day, almost without noticing, the dialogue shifts. The voice speaks, and then it rests. And that's when you realize something important. The silence you were chasing was never the beginning. It was the result. If this resonates with you, you're not alone in this phase. In the next video, we'll go deeper into shadow integration and why awakening often feels lonely before it feels liberating. If this reflection helped you, consider subscribing to Hidden Mind. And if you feel comfortable, share in the comments what this inner voice has been asking of you. Sometimes, naming it is the first step toward letting it rest.